Morning, day 7, and the kitchen smelled unbearably good. Effia dragged the mess hall doors open and rang the bell. It was time for New London to experience a little luxury. Lines of sanded wooden bowls were clacked down on the counter, brimming not with water, not with broth or soup, but with stew. A thick, lumpy meat stew with a leafy garnish added for those coming off the night shift. Their eyes rivaled the beacon that morning. Some cried with relief, their heads in their hands or on the table. Thanks to the hunters, the life out in the Frostlands had been siphoned down to us wretches in the ice pit, and now it felt like we had a chance. There was no way to know if the hunters would even have a scrap of pinecone for us tomorrow, but no one was thinking that far ahead. And so we gulped down the stew, with many banging their empty bowls on the table and calling out for a good old-fashioned New London special for dessert, to much cheer. I received a toast or two that morning. It was hard to bring people down to talk about when we'd run out of coal, that being within the day. If people were ready to rebel over dragging coal from one pile to another, it must have bowled them over to hear my plan to keep them alive this time. Told some boys to meet with 6 and get the drills out of the lab, freshly cleaned thanks to our legion of pint-sized rag hands. That salvation was at all possible had the Royal Crown to thank. The Royals had chartered explorers to survey Greenland's interior for minerals some 2 years ago. The result back was not only that they were so plentiful that veins of coal and iron broke the surface like whales from the wash, but that those of the Yank persuasion were negotiating with the native villagers over it. Must be ashamed to have your children learn nothing from your example. We showed them how it was done with a brief expedition that ensured villagers would no longer be of concern. When the Royal Society was tasked with researching the foul weather back in March, the covert goal that got them their funding was to lay the groundwork for permanent colonies around the various key mineral fields. One ruminates on how our path to hell was paved with good intentions, yet was only paved at all to increase the bond price for heavy aggregates. The point here is that, as you might imagine, our heat tower had been positioned to expose coal and iron aplenty through the ice. Putting it to use was the next labour of life that I was to despotically demand. Later that day, word from the scouts was smacked across a shrinking spool of paper beside the radiograph. They had followed the map to Winterhome and reached the bridge their engineers had built across a gorge. Beyond it was about 200 metres of cleared gravel road that led into a snowdrift. Why was this stretch clear? For it had a proud caretaker looming over it, a gargantuan automaton, a new model from Bristol. It occurs to me that there's a chance that you, the reader, live in a time when the automatons live on, yet we who knew how to make them are gone. I use the word we in a liberal manner in reference to the British Automata Corps, the last decade's scientific pioneers. Well, I suppose I can spare the time for a brief explanation. You will have seen their huge stamping frames carrying about their insectoid bodies. The body encapsulates 3 suites of engineering marvels, which altogether made those hulks the foremost achievement of mankind, to state a not uncommon judgment. The first is a steam core drive, not unlike those used in ships, factories and the like, but adorned with extremely strong pressure tanks for the steam that fuels them. Liberated of the need for a compressor on board, they can march freely around as independent beings of sorts. Of course, a being needs a brain, and again the qualifier of sorts is required. That would be the second marvel. Now, I am not the man to tell you how these work, but it's something to do with these wiry formations of pipes that they call recursive differentiators. That was why that Babbage fellow was famous enough to have a dreadnought named after him. He invented all this, by hook or by crook. The effect was that you did not need to pilot the machine like a crane and such. You only needed to tell it what it was required to achieve, and it would make the necessary assessments to find and carry out a method for it. That is why so many called them beings rather than machines, for with something akin to thought, a soulless variety at least, they had breached the distinction between material and animal. Their third marvel, the most tame, was that which made them useful. An array of tools could be unfolded from its underside and directed around by these rubbery arms pulsating with pressured steam within that provided its muscular flexibility. With these appendages, an automaton could take a spoon and feed you from bowl to mouth without spillage, an achievement beyond many of us even in our adult forms. Excuse me if you knew this already, or if you are perhaps an automaton yourself reading this. No, they cannot read, as I understand it, yet fears that they could do that, and far more, got more newspapers sold over the years than even the announcement of the end times. Kamasi had taught me that they can in fact be disabled with extreme ease, and are sufficiently idiotic in their decision-making to require at least one chaperone. And that was the strange thing about the automaton our fellows had found. It had been alone, clearly tasked with sweeping snow off the roads, but left alone to monitor only a small area until its tanks ran dry. Either Winterhome was overflowing with these things and didn't mind wasting them, or its minder was gone. No bodies visible at the bottom of the gorge, the scouts reported upon my request. The crew speculated murder nonetheless. Didn't bother fueling their paranoia by telling them the machine was on its way to us, courtesy of one of Six's boffins, Hodge, sending some special coordinates to the scout for the automaton to mull over. It had just stamped off our way, apparently, leaving the scouts to follow what used to be the road towards the city. More stealing, but it would have died if we'd left it there anyway. If died is the right term. The scouts were back on the radiograph a few hours later with another discovery. They weren't the only ones searching for Winterhome. They had found a camp with 45 more Londoners and 3 broken-down snowcats. They were what remained of the land dreadnought Dumnonii, which had departed the Wellington depot with a gaggle of Guards Regiment buffoons a few days before I arrived at Edgware. Their dreadnought had taken the same route the Babbage had, but found the ongoing glaciation had blocked the eastern route up from the Atlantic ice sheet. The dreadnought had been entirely lost with most hands when it fell through the ice without warning. The only consolation was that the drivelling idiot the Duke of Connaught went down with it. If he'd made it, I'd be answering to him, and my crew would have died searching for gemstones to adorn his crown of generator shrapnel. The skivers on my crew may have complained that I couldn't be a worse leader, but I, and the people of far more colonies than just Kumasi, knew otherwise. Anyway, the Dumnonii group were apparently on their way to me, lacking the food to make it to Winterhome even with our scouts giving directions. Would have been nice if they'd asked me first, but I had a feeling that Sergeant Godfrey, the lead scout, knew what I was looking for. These wanderers had all manner of gear on their snowcats, and now it was en route to me. Winterhome didn't need it, I can guarantee you that. In New London we'd at last finished clearing out the ruins of the old base. A milestone, but with labours only set to intensify now that we'd need to run mines, dander was high among the fellows. Ollie came back from the North Yard with a bruise across his face. Gathering team had been slacking, trying to do only 10 hours as Lord Gloucester had originally promised. Ollie gave them a mouthful, but that was no peaceful picket. He was about to break out the rifles and settle matters, but I had a better idea. The next day I took a few guys away from renovating the mine buildings and set up a ring of stands behind our tents. After evening mess I invited anyone interested in boxing to meet me out there. Pretty much everyone showed up, lining the edge of the ring. It had been a while since I threw a punch, but I was no amateur. Fashioned some gloves out of scarves and issued the challenge. Got just what I expected. The crowd neighed their approval as Captain Blacknell stepped forwards. It was standard rules, including no shirts, but the sunny day had made the air a mere -30 even at dusk. I knew I had him from the very beginning. He was just as old and creaky as me, but like everyone he'd been on starvation rations for longer before the recent bounties. Hadn't recovered yet, so had to play some odd moves to let him hit me now and again for the sake of the crowd. Fighting in the cold makes it all hurt less, not that you really feel it in the moment. That was what I loved most about boxing. or had loved before my career took me away from the old club at Bridgewater Street. Blacknell tired quickly, and I ended up pushing him to the ground by accident, claiming my win. People seemed to enjoy it enough. Fought one more man, myself. It was Spitting Percy, a piece of work who was half deaf from his time training artillerymen at Larkhill. He was even worse than Blacknell, but at least he was smiling from start to end. I gave up the ring, and as I'd hoped, plenty of others had matters best solved with a little sport. It was fascinating to watch for us all, and gave us something to do with all the paper money people had been hoarding. Yes, most of us had been made very rich by the spree of rapid, untaxed inheritance that went around in early summer. Some people wanted to hang on to all that, just in case. But still, when you've got money on a fight, you don't notice the cold, and that's just a wonderful fact of life. Once I was out of the ring, I had Six taking me aside with bad news. Decided to keep this from everyone else for now. It was another report from Godfrey and Company, and this one twisted the stew out of your stomach in an instant. It was the report I was fearing, nay, expecting. Couldn't bear to read it all the same. It was the first proper news of Winterhome. The scouts were transmitting from the roof of a weather monitoring station a couple of miles from the city. The station had been abandoned, with signs of fighting and an empty larder. Winterhome, they said, was dark. No lights, no movement, no smoke rising from the dark outline of the heat tower. Couldn't be sure it wasn't just under maintenance, but nightfall was no time for that. And besides, they didn't need to be switched off for that, Six told me. So there was only one explanation. I didn't want to hear it, and more importantly, I didn't want anyone else to hear it. Ordered the scouts to come back and keep quiet. Six was sworn to silence, and all evidence of the transmission was stowed away before the kids showed up the next morning. They wouldn't have noticed it even if it was out in the open, to be honest, for that morning everyone was staring mouth agape at the automaton. It had arrived at dawn, and after getting it down the lift with difficulty, it was now striding about and above us. It latched onto the heat tower and took a long swig of steam. Hodges sent it to the coal vein and told it to dig. Dig it did. At first it used its own dangling implements, but then, without prompting, it began to use its tendrils to latch on to the large double-headed drill the crew had set up there. It learned. The coal on the surface was shattered and flew in all directions, but the automaton, the Silver Scot it was called, carefully dragged buckets around the ground to collect it all up, not missing a beat of the drilling either. Hodges was given a roaring round of applause. We had coal enough to turn the heat tower's generator pressure up without losing any temperature, which made the radiators a long way down the pipes from the central hub actually work properly. Not a single tent was weighed down by snow anymore. Even better, the labour freed up by the Silver Scot's arrival allowed us to work iron out of the ground. There was finally hope we could fashion all the little bolts and joints we were severely lacking and banish the tents for good in favour of proper roofs. Things were getting better, and talk of ousting me wasn't reaching the ears of Ollie or Chalk anymore. Only I and the unlucky Illuminati of New London were struggling with the truth, that Winterhome had fared better than us and made a much better go of all this, but as far as any could imagine, they were still all dead.